Hi, I'm Mark Mattioli, and welcome to another reading of Boston Accent. Boston Accent is available on Amazon.com, and it's a mature subject matter. It's an adult read, and I'm still sick, as you can probably tell, but we're going to read anyway. I just actually started reading it, and I found several typos. I mean, I know there's been a few here and there, but I just found a real bad section, and if you bought the book, I apologize for this. I do my own editing, and it's something I gotta work on. I'm not as thorough as I should be. Kind of assume that it's all hunky dory, and it's not. One of my readers pointed it out to me in a private email that I gave one of my characters two different names, and I thought it was just at the beginning of the book, and then it showed up at the end of the book different, and it's not. I got one segment where the guy has two different names on the same freaking page. So that's not good. So I've made the corrections, and I'm going to read it with the corrections. And if you bought the book, once again, I apologize, and we can only improve going forward. Let's hope. All right. That aside, let's see. I got to write down the friggin' time here. Okay. All right, I think we're ready now. Boston Accent. I had two more visitors come out to visit me in Tahoe. One was Rick Price, who had introduced me to Gretchen. The other was a close friend of Rick's that I knew of, but had spent very little time with, by the name of Chuck Pullman. Chuck grew up on the other side of Pineville and was the oldest of six, with four brothers and a sister. The boys were known in the area as brawlers, and all except one would go into boxing. Chuck himself had just won his Golden Gloves in the annual tournament. I was very surprised when Rick called me and told me they were driving out to see me. I was more surprised when they told me they loved Tahoe so much that they had decided to stay. I had told them up front that there was already 4 people in my house, and they couldn't stay there. Rick said no problem, they would find a place to stay. The thing about Rick and Chuck during this time period is that they were both drinking heavy. When they drank, they liked to either have sex or beat people up. They would walk into the toughest bar in any town USA and start giving attitude to some pretty tough characters. Rick would usually sit back and watch, while Chuck would literally knock out anyone foolish enough to stand up to him. The idea that these two were going to invade my little paradise made me more than a little apprehensive. It took Rick and Chuck 6 days to drive from Boston to Tahoe in a stolen car. It wasn't technically stolen, but it had been reported stolen in an insurance scam by an acquaintance of Rick's. The car was a small foreign compact with a bad carburetor and a stick shift that made driving it a nightmare. Somehow they managed the 3,000 plus miles and neither killed the car or had been arrested. The first week they were in town, they basically just raised holy hell. The second week they decided to look for work. They were both hired by a landscaper and began working full time. They bought a tent and camping gear and were living in the woods not far from me. I was encouraged that they were working, but I was very surprised that they actually wanted to live here. We got together a few times and went hiking, including one afternoon when Frank joined us and we all ate mushrooms. We were hiking a trail on the California side of the lake called Eagle Rock. And quite a distance up the mountain, we came across a rock formation that looked like an eagle. Rick and Chuck climbed up on the rock so I could take a picture, and Chuck scared the crap out of Rick by telling him the eagle was standing up. We all had a good laugh over that one. Actually, we laughed all the way up and all the way down. We were tripping. On the way down the mountain, Frank and I left the trail and started running straight down the mountain in what looked like an area where there had been a landslide years before. Mixed in with the loose sand were manzanita bushes with razor-sharp leaves. We were wearing shorts, and the leaves cut up our legs as we ran through them. Frank was cut up pretty good and decided to look for the original trail and the others. I continued by myself straight down till the slide ended and the landscape changed to thick woods. I looked down at my legs. and I had blood streaming down them. I knew if I walked straight down towards the lake, I would eventually hit a road. As I made my way through the woods, I began to get a little paranoid, and the thought of bears crept into my head. This was grizzly bear country after all. While thinking about bears, I heard a twig snap and froze. As I looked around, I came face to face with a huge elk with a large rack. I slowly reached for my camera and my pack, but as I did, it ran crashing through the woods. My heart was racing at its powerful sight. I continued on and found the road shortly after. By the time I got to where the car was parked, everyone was waiting for me. I told them about the elk, and Frank said, "You're lucky it wasn't a bear." No shit. I got together with Rick and Chuck one night to have dinner, and I talked them into going to a Mexican restaurant. They were both very leery, having never had it before. There weren't a whole lot of Mexican restaurants in New England in the 1970s. I myself had never had it till I arrived in California, and I became an instant fan. Up until then, my food of choice had been Italian, and Chuck, being Italian, felt the same way. Rick was pretty much a meat and potato guy, and he was the toughest to sell the Mexican food idea. I actually didn't choose a family-run Mexican restaurant like I should have, and there were two great ones in town. I instead chose a corporate chain restaurant called Pablo O'Boyle's. They advertised Mexican and Irish food, which I thought might be the way to go in case Rick and Chuck got real stubborn with the Mexican food. This way, they could at least order from the Irish menu, which has something they're familiar with. While going over the menu, I'm pushing the Mexican food because I really want them to not only try it, but fall in love with it like I have. Rick's reading the menu, and he sees refried beans as a side, and asks our waiter if those are leftovers, which I find is hysterical, but no one else is laughing. The waiter is trying to explain refried beans while I continue to laugh, and Rick and Chuck are looking at me like, "What are we doing here?" The waiter and I help Rick and Chuck make their selections, and we munch on complimentary chips and salsa while downing margaritas like they're water. When the food arrives, Rick and Chuck seem a little more open-minded as they sample their food. Everything is going great until Chuck finds a pebble in his beans. Now, I did some research after this incident and found that it's common for an occasional small stone to get in with the beans. It's up to the chef to spot it and remove it. This did not help my selling of Mexican culture, and Chuck and Rick stopped eating and told our waiter they wanted to speak to a manager. The manager came to the table where Chuck told him, "I found a rock on my food. You ruined my meal, and I'm not paying for it." The manager said, "Fine. You won't be charged for it. My apologies." Rick then told the manager he wasn't paying for his either because the incident had ruined their meal. The manager saw Jack had barely touched his food and said, "Fine, you don't have to pay either." The manager tells the waiter to remove the plates and looks at my plate, which is clean. "No problem with the food, sir?" The manager asked me, and I tell him it was fine. Chuck says he'll pay the tab as it was his idea to treat me to dinner. What I don't know is that he stiffs the waiter. Chuck doesn't give him a bad tip, he gives him nothing. We're out in the parking lot climbing into Rick and Chuck's stolen car when the waiter comes up to the window. "Was there a problem with the service?" the waiter asks. "I don't like rocks in my food," Chuck tells him. The waiter has a puss on his face, and he says, "I didn't prepare your food. I served it, and I need to be compensated for that." Now, this waiter has no idea what Chuck is capable of, and he is really pushing his luck. Chuck tells him to get his ass back in the restaurant before he really gives him something to cry about. The waiter shakes his head, turns to go back in the restaurant, and under his breath he says, "Asshole." Rick hears him, tells Chuck, and Chuck gets out of the car and starts to go after him. The waiter, now realizing a little too late that he may have gone too far with the wrong person, is practically running into the restaurant with Chuck in pursuit. "Come here, you little fuck. You call me an asshole?" I jump out of the car and convince Chuck to drop it before they call the cops. Rick thinks it's funny and wants Chuck to go in the restaurant after the waiter. Chuck is undecided on what he wants to do when he spots the manager and the waiter watching from the window. Chuck starts yelling and waving to the waiter to come out, and the manager has the waiter get out of view. Chuck then gives the manager the finger and heads back to the car. As Chuck is getting in the car, he notices customers arriving and walking towards the restaurant, and he yells to them, "Don't eat the food here. There's rocks in it." Rick is still laughing as we drive out onto the main road, and Chuck is still mad and still hungry. I suggest we hit a casual burger joint, and off we go for a fairly incident-free rest of the evening. Rick and Chuck never ate Mexican food again, and God help anyone that even brought it up in a conversation. Okay, we're going to make this a short one today, because this next segment is long. I don't think I have time to read it. Oh, it was close. I got about 6 minutes. We'll go for it. We'll see what happens. We hosted a golf tournament in the CC, complete with cocktail party and sit-down dinner. When it was over, the hotel barbacks left 2 cases of beer sitting out that should have been put back in stock. I pulled them out of the function room so we could reset for the next client and set them on a table in the service hallway. The following day, I came back into work, and the 2 cases were still there. I wasn't the only one who noticed. Joel and Frank picked up on it, too. Now, I had seen Sven walk right out the door with a punch bowl set on a room service card, so I figured I could get away with it also. Earlier that day, my supervisor, John Fries, had asked me to grab any unused notebooks left behind by clients. John said he would use them for night school. I found a large box, big enough to fit the 2 cases of beer in side by side, and covered them with some notebooks for John. There was still some room on the sides, so I grabbed some linen napkins and wrapped up several sets of hotel silverware and used them to stuff the box so that the cases didn't slide around. I then sealed the box with colored duct tape that we used to tape down AV cords. I then took a black magic marker and wrote on the 2 longest sides of the box, Smythe Brothers, Boston, Mass. Smythe was Jared's last name, and this was sort of a private joke dedication to him. The next thing I did was grab a room service cart and put a tablecloth on it. I added the Smythe Brothers box to the cart, and it was ready to go. Now all I needed was a card to put the box in. I called John on my radio and asked him to meet me in the CC. When John showed up and saw how big the box was, his jaw dropped, and he said, "What the fuck is that?" I told him the box contained the notebooks he wanted, plus 2 cases of beer. And he just stared at me with his mouth open and a look of disbelief on his face. He looked back and forth from Joel to Frank to me and said, "You're out of your fucking minds." I said, "You wanted notebooks, we want beer, and we need a car to put it in." John stood there shaking his head from side to side, not happy at all, and finally said, "I could have the beer. If you get caught, I don't know anything about this." "Fine. Where's your car?" I said, as I headed towards the public elevator, which would bring us right across from a set of doors that led to the employee parking garage. "On the roof, in the far corner, it's unlocked," John said, as said to my back as I stepped into the elevator. Frank decides to walk with me, while Joel didn't want to have anything to do with it. We exit the elevator and head across the casino floor past the banks of slot machines, while the computer jingles fill the air. As we approach the doors that will take us outside to the garage, I notice there isn't any security guard in sight. This is too easy, I'm thinking, as Frank holds the doors open for me, and I exit the building, rolling the cart into the parking garage. In the garage, we take another elevator to the roof. Once on the roof, I head towards the back corner, where I see John's car parked. Frank walks ahead of me and tries the passenger door of the two-door sedan, and it opens. Frank gets on one side of the box, with me on the other side. And as we start to lift it, we hear, "Stop right there." We turn to see a security guard approaching in a golf cart, and under our breath, at the same time, we both say, "Fuck." The guard jumps off the cart, points to the box, and says, "What's in the box?" Frank and I look at each other, and Frank shrugs and says, "I don't know." The guard says, "What do you mean you don't know?" I say, "He means we don't know exactly. Our supervisor told us to put this in his car. He said something about it being notebooks left over from a convention that a client said he could have for night school. You can call him to confirm. His name is John Freeze, and he's on channel 3 on your radio. The security guard switches to channel 3 on his radio and says, "Security to John Freeze." There's no response, and the guard's eyes are going back and forth from the box to us. "Security to John Freeze," repeats over the radio, and after a period of dead air that seems like a lifetime, we hear, "John Freeze is in a meeting. This is Elliot Randall. Is there something I can help you with?" The security guard takes a couple of steps away from us and says, "Elliot, I have 2 employees from the convention center in the parking garage loading a large box into a car that supposedly belongs to John Freeze. Do you know anything about this?" I hear Elliot say, "What are their names?" And I say, "Nino and Frank Eli. The notebooks are for John Freeze." The guard repeats the information to Elliot. I hear Elliot say, "They're okay." The guard says, "Copy that, thank you," switches his radio back to the security channel, nods and says, "You're all set, sorry to bother you." I force a smile, say, "Not a problem," and turn to Frank, who is white as a ghost, and say, "Let's get it in the car now." We place the box in the back seat and head back into the casino. The whole time we're walking, Frank is muttering, "That was fucked. We could have lost our jobs. We could have been arrested. Oh my God, that was too close." He just went on and on while I pushed the cart back to the convention center as quickly as I could. As we step off the elevator into the main aisle of the convention center, I see Elliot standing in the middle of the aisle, looking at me with his arms crossed across his chest, looking all business. Elliot was a large man of Nordic ancestry with pale white skin covered in freckles, with a thick shock of bright red hair on his head. He stood around 6'4", weighed maybe 260. I roll the card up to him, and he looks at me very serious in a low voice, says, "What did you just do?" I look around, make sure no one else can hear us, and I say, "I grabbed 2 cases of beer that the Barbecs left up here 2 days ago." Elliot shakes his head and says, "I fucking knew it. It was something. Fucking knew it was something when I heard your name. You're lucky it was me." I nod my head in agreement and say, I know. I'm sorry to get involved. It won't happen again." Okay, we're out of time, so we're going to take a pause. And you know what? I think I'm going to come back here and read some more. All right, Mark Mattioli, reading Boston Accent. I'll be right back with to continue this. Boston Accent is available on Amazon.com.